Welcome everyone to the Xojo webinar. I'm Paul Lefevre, the Xojo Developer Evangelist, and our topic this time is The Wonderful World of Windows, my catchy title, but we're going to talk a bit about Xojo and Windows, and I'll have a couple things I can show you, and then we'll take questions. So Windows and Xojo. Xojo has been able to build Windows apps for a long time, since 1999, actually. And actually, that is a really long time. Obviously, when it first came out, it was Mac only, but Windows was added very quickly. A few years after that, the Windows IDE was added to Xojo, so that you could actually run Xojo on Windows and then develop from there. And that's been the case ever since. There's always been a Windows IDE since 2003. Today, Xojo supports Windows 7, Windows 8, and that includes 8.1. I think Microsoft kind of forces you these days to upgrade any plain old Windows 8 installations to 8.1. And then, of course, Windows 10, which seems to be just the current versioning for whatever version of Windows is out there. They're putting out a couple releases a year, but keeping the naming as Windows 10. And I believe the last version of that had the name Fall Creators Update, I think. But Xojo supports all three of these. And what capabilities do you get with Xojo on Windows? Well, of course, you can make desktop apps. And these are native WinAPI apps. Now, perhaps you haven't heard the term WinAPI. That's actually Microsoft's new name for what they used to call the Win32 framework. And they had to come up with a new name because the Win32 framework wasn't really well named for 64-bit apps, which actually also use the Win32 framework. That's a little confusing. So they were like, well, rather than constantly trying to explain that, we're going to need to come up with a new name. So we're going to go with WinAPI. And that's the progression. Back in the super old days of the Windows 3.1 era, there was the Win16 framework. And then when Windows 95 came out, Win32 replaced it and wasn't really compatible with it. And then, 20 odd years in the future, they realized that naming wasn't the best idea. So now WinAPI is the name. So if you're searching through Microsoft Docs on things, you'll often see the usage of WinAPI. You can also, of course, make web apps on Windows. These can be standalone apps. They have their own embedded web server, so you don't really have to do anything other than run the web app itself. And you can also create CGI apps for use with Apache. And Xojo can make console apps. These can just be apps that you run on the command line, little utilities or something that you need to run as part of a script. Or you can create a console app that gets installed as a Windows service so that it will launch when the computer does and kind of keep running in the background. That kind of can work hand in hand with the standalone web apps. We have a lot of people that will create a standalone web app and then have it be installed as a service on the Windows machine so that it stays up and running. So what are some of the Windows-specific features that Xojo offers? Well, there's the Office automation capability. This gives you access to Microsoft Office products such as Word, Excel, and PowerPoint, and allows you to connect to essentially the Visual Basic for Applications object model so that you can manipulate the documents in those apps. Often you can port VBA scripts into Xojo pretty easily if you're familiar with the Visual Basic object model, but it allows you to control Office in that manner, which is not something that's available on Mac. The component object model allows you to connect to other things that are installed on your Windows computer. That can vary between controls and system services and stuff like that. One example I'll show you in a bit is a reporting tool called Combit List and Label. Object linking and embedding is also available, very similar to COM, to connect to other objects that are on the system. And then ActiveX controls. Some of them can be used with Xojo itself, which has an insert option in the menu to add ActiveX controls. Depending on the control, it might work as is, or it might require a little bit of tweaking. Some of the recent Windows features that have been added to Xojo include the ability to make 64-bit apps. You can actually build your apps as 64-bit now. These, of course, will require a 64-bit version of Windows. And that is becoming more and more common, but it's not 100% the case. So if you are distributing apps and you have users who are still using 32-bit versions of Windows, you probably are going to need to have separate installers if you want to support both those versions of Windows. I believe most of the installer tools these days do have some way to detect which version of Windows is running and then install the appropriate version. So that might also be an option. About a year ago, the graphics subsystem in Xojo was switched out from the legacy GDI Plus graphics framework to a combination of Direct2D and DirectWrite. This gives us access to more powerful graphics capabilities that are built into modern versions of Windows. Theoretically, they're going to give us better graphics driver support, transparency. One of the big things that enabled was the ability to have and work with high DPI displays. These are those super sharp displays that, make text look like it was printed on paper. I use a 4K display, actually, and I have it running in what would be high DPI mode. So it essentially, my display acts as if it's a 1080p display, but because it actually has essentially 4 1080p screens in there, everything is super crisp and sharp. And for someone with eyes like mine, you really can appreciate it when your screen is just that crisp and easy to work with. And that is enabled by Direct2D and DirectWrite because those are the more modern graphics frameworks that are used in Windows these days. 64-bit support in Windows is continuing to be enhanced. One of the things that was recently added was the ability for app icons to actually be included in the 64-bit app itself. That wasn't immediately available right off the bat. The Xojo framework was introduced a few years ago, and one of the new features it had was the HTTP socket, which added HTTP 1.1 support. On Windows, that mostly worked. It had a couple issues in threads that have since been resolved, I think, earlier this year. So that is now available for use on Windows and is a great way to connect to web services and other things. And on Windows, you have the option of using the Chromium embedded framework for your HTML viewer. This is enabled when you add an HTML viewer and you change the renderer from native, which would use the system default Internet Explorer renderer, and you switch it from native to WebKit. And now on Windows, you'll end up with the Chromium embedded framework and the new version 3 added to your built app. This does add quite a bit of DLLs and other things to your built app, but it does give you probably more consistent rendering experience for your HTML. So something people often choose to enable. So what is coming for Windows in 2017 Release 3? Well, for all platforms, including Windows, the Xojo IDE will now be 64-bit. This is pretty big news because it's a major stepping stone on the path to our overall 64-bit support. It also means the IDE will be able to better make use of all the RAM that are in today's modern computers. A 32-bit IDE, obviously, being a 32-bit app, can take advantage of, 3 gigabyte-ish of RAM, which for many projects might be fine, but for larger projects, that can be a bit of a bottleneck. So with a 64-bit IDE, the RAM ceiling goes up much, much higher, allowing you to build more projects, have more things open, that sort of thing. It does, of course, mean that you will need a 64-bit version of Windows in order to run Xojo itself. Xojo will still, of course, be able to create 32-bit apps. Just the IDE will be requiring 64-bit. Also, in 2017 release 3, there's going to be a new setting for when you're building Windows apps to indicate which version of Windows is actually supported, 7, 8, or 10. There'll be little flip sweat settings there. And that will actually update settings in the official Windows manifest, which is now a standard thing that's used when you build 64-bit apps. And along with that, there's also a security setting that allows you to specify the user access level for when the app is run. So, standard or administrator, stuff like that. So you can see here in the task manager, Xojo running, and it doesn't have the little parentheses 32-bit that you would see if you were running Xojo on a 64-bit version of Windows. And these are the new build settings for the supported versions and the security privileges. When can you expect 2017 release 3? Well, you can expect it in December. That's be about as specific as I can get right now. So stay tuned. Keep an eye out. And what is coming in 2018? Well, we got a couple things on the plate right now. First of all is Windows 64-bit debugging. We have 64-bit debugging for all our other platforms right now, Mac, Linux, iOS. But Windows does not yet have 64-bit debugging. And the LLVM compiler toolset seems to be at a spot where it now has the capabilities on the Windows version that will allow this to work. So that's going to be a primary focus in 2018. And that is great because when you're building 64-bit apps, or when you're doing anything really, you want to be able to test it the way that you're going to ship it. And it can be trickier sometimes to try and ship something 64-bit if you can't debug any issues you may run into. In addition, we are working on updates to the Xojo Windows framework to reduce overall flickering. This is going to kind of change under the hood stuff for how controls and windows and other things get rendered and handle transparency and a few other things. There really won't be anything your apps will have to do other than be recompiled with the version of Xojo that uses this updated framework. Initial tests are quite promising. Flickering essentially goes down to 0 without you having to really do much. You'll still obviously on your canvases want to draw things appropriately, but other controls and things, flickering becomes a thing of the past. So looking forward to those things in 2018. Now I mentioned a little bit about declares. Declares are the way that you directly access the WinAPI framework to call essentially operating system routines that for things that are not built into Xojo's framework. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff in the official operating system framework, the WinAPI framework, that Xojo doesn't implement. So I'm going to now introduce a new open source project called WinAPILib. This is open source on GitHub. This is essentially going to be an updated version of the older Windows, now I'm forgetting the name of it, the WFS, Windows, what the heck was that called now? Windows Functionality Suite. That was an old project created 10, 15 years ago, and it's still available on GitHub, but it is pretty tied to 32-bit. And it is hard, oh, not hard, but sometimes it just, specific things just won't work when you build for 64-bit. It also has a lot of legacy code in it for WinAPI things that are no longer relevant because they were more applicable to the Windows 95 era of the framework rather than more modern versions. So what I've started here is a new open source library. And essentially I'm going to be, you can almost think of it as a customized fork of the old one, where I'll be putting stuff in, updating stuff to make sure it works on 64-bit, so that we have more access to Windows things. You can find it on GitHub here. We'll look at it a little bit in a moment. It does not, at this point, have everything that was in the Windows functionality suite, the old one that had been in development for many, many years and had more things in it. So I'm starting small with some stuff and certainly always willing to accept contributions. So let's switch over to Xojo here and take a look at a couple things. All right, the first thing I have open here is the list and label example project. And before I do that, I'm going to go here to Microsoft Edge. And if you go to the combit website, they actually have a page for the example project with Xojo. You can find it pretty easily by just typing Xojo in the search box on their page. And you can download this project right from there. We have a partnership with them to keep this up to date and show how it can be used. So essentially, this is a pretty robust reporting tool with a designer and the ability to print or export reports in a variety of formats. So I will just run this. And I'm going to click the export button. This is just going to connect to our Eddie's electronics sample database that we use for a lot of things and just print out a list of the customers that are in that database. So here, this is using the preview option of list and label, which has, or I should say the export option, which has a variety of ways that you can output your report, including its built-in previewer, but it also has a PDF, which is nice. So I'm just going to leave it on in the preview. And you can see it comes up with the list and label previewer. And you can see the data is in here from the SQLite database that contains the customers. And there's like 7 pages. And you can also see the designer. Well, it's a little small. And, you can put fields where you want and handle formatting and all kinds of other stuff. This is implemented primarily as, I guess it's an OLE container you can see here. And so essentially list and label's been installed on this computer. Rather than adding it as an ActiveX component, which added all kinds of things that required a bit of tweaking. Instead, came up here to find the one we wanted and grab the program ID and then just use that right here. So added the control with the program ID. And then from that point forward, you can manually work with the list and label API to add stuff. So you can see here, this is prompting for the file. And then it starts to call various list and label methods that are described in their API to do things. So this starts a printing. This displays the export dialog. Code here then initializes the record set to the SQLite database and loops through it, sets up the fields, on the report. Again, by calling list and label function and assigning to it data from the record set. And it does that for each row. And then ends the print when it's done. Actually, that's down here where the while loop is. So this can serve as an example for how you can use list and label in your project. And list and label can do a lot more than what's shown here. This has examples for using the export capability, printing directly to the printer, and then opening the designer. All right, now let's switch to WinAPILib. And I just want to point out that if you want to grab that, you can, of course, go to the GitHub site. And if you've never used GitHub before, this green button, the clone or download button, you can just download this project as a zip. If you don't want to worry about Git or set up a Git client or any of that sort of stuff, you can just do that. I have installed here SourceTree, which is a free Git client. And then using the URL that's provided here, I can essentially clone the project down to the computer so that I can access it. And then if I want to make changes, I can send them up to the GitHub site. They'll appear here as pull requests. So if you did that, you would be able to make changes, push them up to the site. I would get notified of pull requests, which I can then review and then add them to the project for everyone to benefit from. So if you haven't ever used Git before, we've got a few webinars on Git that have been done in the past, and there's certainly a lot of stuff on the internet in general about it, but it's a great source control tool. And if you have anything you can help provide to add to this, that would be awesome. So let's run this so you can see some of the stuff that's in here now. I got a demo window that demonstrates a few things at this point. So we can see, for simple things, I've got a button here that flashes the border. If we click on another window, you can see that gets stuck in the background. But if we turn on the always topmost thing, it doesn't go away when I click on something else. It stays up in the front. There's the ability to capture a screen. So here I can capture the top left corner of the screen as a picture that I can display or save or do whatever I want. You can grab some system information directly from Windows, computer name and other things. You can grab some OS information. The major version isn't actually quite correct on Windows 10. That will actually only be correct if you're building a 64-bit version of Windows, because that particular Windows API requires something in the manifest to be set, which only happens with 64-bit versions of Windows, actually starting with R3 or later. You can tweak this to control the opacity of the window, essentially make it a bit transparent. And you can see here the CPU usage is being updated in the background. Higher than I would expect, but probably because the Zoom client is running to do the webinar and the screen recording and all that. It's chugging along. And then this is an example of a custom type of button that is available in Windows called the command link button. So that's some of the stuff that is in this project to start with. And that is all included in the folder here with the WinAPILib folder, which at this point just has a single thing, a module called WinAPILib. And then in it, it has various classes that allow you to access those capabilities. Let's see. So, for an example, the simple one here, You always prefix it with the namespace of WinAPILib, and then you can call the particular method based on how it's defined. Right now, there's no full docs or anything for this because it's evolving. So you have to actually go into the class and read what it has for public methods and that sort of stuff. But hopefully is a useful starting point and will help people. You can see looking at these things here that these are declares of varying complexity. Creating declares on Windows is interesting. You'll get used to reading Microsoft Docs. If you're interested in monkeying around with declares, the docs do a pretty good job of telling you which library contains the function. The WinAPI is primarily C-based and uses a lot of structures, the more complicated calls anyway. So you often have to create a structure of some kind, set the values, and then you can call the method. So hopefully this project also helps serve as an example for creating declares for people. And then if people come up with a cool declare, they can submit it to the project. All right, well, those are the two main projects I wanted to show you today on Windows. So I want to remind everyone, Xojo.com/download is where you can always grab the latest version of Xojo to test out, try. This webinar will be available at the dev site, the dev center, developer.xojo.com, webinar-world Windows, and the recording and other links will be available there. And I want to remind everyone that the Xojo Developer Conference, XDC, is next year, April 25th to 27th, 2018, in Denver, Colorado. You can sign up, read more about it at xojo.com/XDC. The list of sessions and presenters is all up there, so you can see what sort of content would be available. You don't really want to delay signing up too much. We are way ahead of registrations for the last XDC. So it's always possible it could sell out. It did sell out a few years ago when we had the XDC conference in Las Vegas. So you definitely want to check it out there. Before the end of the year comes, you may find that you have some extra money sitting around in budget somewhere that might be appropriate to sign up for XDC before the end of the year. So definitely check that out. See if there's sessions that interest you. We'd love to see you there. Thanks, everyone, for attending. Have a great day.